Pardon? Was it 5 minutes late? Let's late walk 1 more minute. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, if you will take your seats, please, and we're about to start. So I'm going to do the introduction. My name is Ira Wolfson. This is a familiar territory to me, having come to this church for the high holidays for over 20 years, and I thank the church for its hospitality. I know it intimately. Several years ago, in 2018, we had a service where I brought this poster. And this had to do with the attack of the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018. And I listed the individuals who were killed, and it also occurred that there was a shooting in the supermarket, which were targeting people on the basis of their color, their race. And then after that service, I put it away in the closet, and I thought, maybe one day I'll use the back for another. But it turns out that if I had every shooting that occurred, and I made another poster, there would be more. My closet would be filled. We'd have to get a storage center to store all these posters.
You have to stand close to the mic.
Thank you. Okay. My teacher voice is gone. So I brought this again just to remind us that if you don't study the past, you tend to repeat it in the future. We all know that that's true at this point. And my introduction is why study, why remember the Shoah, why it matters. And so if you'll allow me to put my glasses on, I can actually read what I wrote. So attending a Holocaust program and listening to the stories of those who will soon be gone is a way of saying Kaddish, or memorial prayer, for the memory of those who have no one else, for remembering so that they are not forgotten. This annual Memorial Holocaust program explores sacrifice, survival, memory, and allows us, those sitting in our comfortable seats, to be witnesses to an extreme history, to hear the stories, remember the past, and confront the future. Attending such programs often makes one uncomfortable. The stories of survivors or about survivors are difficult to hear, painful to visualize. They are complex. They are unbearably sad. Many of us know the stories all too well, having seen the movies, read the books, and heard the tales. Every program, every story is unique and important. So having a Holocaust Memorial program and listening to these stories is a way of saying Kaddish, or a memorial prayer for those who have no one else. It is most important that we honor those who tell these stories of survival, that we honor their resilience and their bravery, that we hear of those who were righteous, and that we listen and memorialize the stories so that we can tell others the stories for the first time, for all time. And since 1963, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Jerusalem, has been honoring non-Jewish individuals around the world who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. They are known as the righteous among nations. And so far, there are more than 26,500 individuals on the list. During the Nazi period, Everyone had to make a moral choice. Some people became perpetrators, others were bystanders, but a small and brave minority chose to help the persecuted. These are the rescuers and helpers. This was an extraordinary sacrifice, an extraordinary selfless choice. It meant risking not only their own lives, but the lives of their family, children. Many paid with their lives. None succeeded in halting the Holocaust, but many people survived as a result of their efforts. Those regarded as rescuers may have hidden someone for a few hours, overnight, or 2 or 3 years. Some may have saved one life, some have saved 1,000. But whatever the scale, each deed was as significant as the other. But the Bible reminds us whoever takes a life, or rather, who saves a life, it is as if you have saved the whole world. I often look at pictures of survivors who are surrounded by their family and think that had no one helped them, that family would never have been there in the future. Stories of survivors are found in every Nazi-occupied country and from all walks of life. Their actions demonstrate that true heroes are often just ordinary people acting on their convictions. Many were surprised by what they had done and deemed it not to be exceptional. The Nazis were brutal in their reprisals against anyone who was caught assisting Jews. Bystanders themselves had good reason to be concerned for their personal safety. This in turn makes the actions of those who did resist the more remarkable. Their actions were selfless, but no less calculated. They knew the potential risk, but acted anyway. So attending this kind of a program and listening to the stories is a way of saying a memorial prayer for the memory of those who have no one else. So I think it's important to recognize that and hope that it does not come to us that we have to make those kinds of choices. And we don't live in the world at this point that's so extreme that we have to think about that. But what we do need to think about is what can each of us do that would make the climate of hatred and prejudice be less. You notice I didn't say disappear, but I did say make it less. So this program tonight is designed to bring to your attention the things that you would think about as you go home, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ira. I'm deadline. Most of you can't vote. Oh, I have to figure out how to. So working?
No.
Now is it working?
No. It's on. It's on.
Green light is on.
Try it again.
Hello? Ah, okay. Oh. Thank you so much. Thank you to Ira. I asked him to help us think about why the Holocaust that happened 80 years ago matters. And it matters. It will always matter. That we get the lessons, that we learn the lessons from that horrible time. Traditionally, on Yom HaShoah, we light 6 yahrzeit candles. They're right here. These are yahrzeit candles. Jews use them to remember on the anniversary of anyone they love who has passed away. I just learned myself, which I should know, coming from a German family, that yahrzeit is a German word. Jahr meaning year and zeit meaning time. And it means anniversary. Okay, it means anniversary, yahrzeit, anniversary. It's a German word, actually. I light them for my parents, and my husband lights them for his parents, and so on. But of course, in the Holocaust, we don't know the anniversary of the people who died, for the most part. So we choose Yom HaShoah as a day that, as Ira said, that we remember 6 million, and many, many others who died during that horrible time. So we remember those who died, and the survivors, and the resistors, and always the righteous who volunteered to save people. And I will say, briefly, I just found out that 2 people in my family, which I did not know, who had gone to Paris to get out of Germany, actually survived in a convent, and I did not know that. I knew they survived, but I didn't know how they survived. And my uncle who was in the American Army found them there. So, I am going to ask people to light each candle, and let me find my thing here. First, Ira, who you already know, and Bernice are going to light candle number 1. I've asked everybody who's on the committee to light candles today, and I thank them for being part of this. Here, use this one. Use this one. Doesn't matter. This candle. The microphone.
Where is the mic? I have a teacher's voice anyway. But this candle is for all of my both grandparents on both sides, all of the people who perished, aunts, uncles, cousins. I never knew any of them since they never made it to this country, except for my paternal grandparents who came in April 1939, miraculously, just before the war started. So, thank you.
And candle number 2, I'm asking Reverend Rod McDonald and Madeline Hillistonine, who've been on the committee helping us plan this, to please light candle number 2.
Together. Ele Escara. These I will remember. The victims of the Treblinka killing camp in German-occupied Poland. Treblinka had 925,000 prisoners with only 67 known survivors. And we remember the 105,000 Jews who were murdered in the Netherlands during the Holocaust.
And we remember the 5,851 righteous of the Netherlands who put others above themselves to save lives. Zikronom Levraka, may their names be always for a blessing. Amen.
And candle number 3, Cheryl Schley and Robert Melson are going to light candle number 3. And I think mention some family names.
So this is in memory of my grandmother, Stefania Batsheva Grom-Ponchek, my grandfather, both of them on my mother's side, Leib Yehuda Ponchek. She died in Treblinka, he died at Auschwitz. My grandfather on my father's side, who committed suicide when the Germans tried to arrest him. My other grandmother died before the war.
And this is for my father, David Schley, who survived 4 concentration camps, actually 5, and for his family, his mother, his father, and his 3 brothers who were perished in the Holocaust.
And we remember the victims of the Belzec killing camp in German-occupied Poland. Belzec housed 435,000 prisoners. There are only 8 known survivors. I should note that when we were in Stanislavov, Belzec was the place we were supposed to go, but somehow we missed that appointment.
And we remember the 90,000 Jews who were murdered in France during the Holocaust. And we remember the 4,130 righteous of France who put others above themselves to save lives. Zikronam Livraka. May their names always be for a blessing. Amen.
Pastor Christian Hollick and Fran Coco, also from our committee, thank you. We'll light candle number 4.
Eli Ezkara, these I will remember. Sobibor killing camp in German-occupied Poland. Sobibor concentration camp housed 200,000 prisoners. There are only 58 known survivors. We remember the 450,000 Jews who were murdered in Hungary during the Holocaust.
And we remember the 2,659 righteous of Ukraine who put others above themselves to save lives. Zikronim Livraka. May their names be always for a blessing. Amen.
Thank you. And our past presidents, Renata Wasserman and Arlene Cohn. Do you want me to bring the candle? Get out of your way. It's okay. It's okay.
Thank you. Harriet must be, where's Harriet?
She's doing something later. You got it. Yep.
Ele Ezkara, these I will remember.
Unfortunately, I have lost some family members of the Holocaust too. I was actually born in Berlin, but managed to get here before the war thanks to a wonderful uncle. So my whole family has to thank him. But my father's youngest sister, Hannah Windmiller, never made it out. And my cousin Trixie's parents were on the first train to Auschwitz from Belgium. Her father tried to escape and was shot and killed. The mother ended up at Auschwitz and was never heard from again. My cousin Trixie survived. She's in Chicago. She's the same age as I am. So we're the 2 survivors of that family.
And I think we met your cousin a couple of years ago when she spoke. Yes.
Thank you. And we remember the victims of Chelmno killing camp in Germany, occupied Poland. 172,000 people were imprisoned in Chelmno concentration camp, and there were only 7 known survivors. Do you want to read this last one? Can you see it? Oh.
Go ahead, finish it.
Okay. We remember the 75,000 Jews who were murdered in Slovakia during the Holocaust. And we remember
the 1,767 righteous of Bergligios who put themselves above others to save lives. May their names always be a blessing. Amen.
And Jessica, Dill, and I are going to light the last candle.
Ele Ezra. These I will
These
remember.
I will remember. I'm going to list people in my dad's family. Both of my parents were from Germany and came and escaped in February 1939. These are my dad's family. My father's grandmother, who they called Oma Marta, which means grandmother, Martha Wolfes Hertzfeld. She died en route to a concentration camp, and that's another story for another day, but she was 71. This is all one family. My father's uncle, Dr. Otto Wolfes, died in a concentration camp at age 49, very near the end of the war, February 1945. His wife perished probably earlier. She was 45, and their two children, who both were nurses, my dad's cousins, Ilse and Ursula Wolfes, perished at very near the end of the war in a concentration camp at ages 21 and 25. My father didn't find out about a lot of this till 40 years later, and I don't know if people realize how long. There are still people who have no idea what happened to their families, so I'm happy that I can mention their names.
And we remember the victims of the Majdanek killing camp in German-occupied Poland. 150,000 prisoners were imprisoned in Majdanek. There were 72,000 survivors.
And we remember the and we remember the 600,000 Jews who were murdered in Romania and the 40,000 Jews who were murdered in Belgium during the Holocaust.
And we remember the 5 righteous of the United States who put others above themselves to save lives. May their names be for a blessing.
Thank you, Jessica. So we have asked, and thank you so much, Judy Keller of Am Hayam and Paul Beagleson of Am Hayam to lead us in the Kaddish, and that this is the prayer that we say to remember the departed. And everybody has it on the back of their program, so if you feel comfortable reciting with us, that would be wonderful.
Kaddish is an Aramaic word meaning holiness. It comes from the Hebrew word kadosh, holy. The Kaddish is a deeply meaningful prayer that expresses and reflects the values of the Jewish people. Kaddish is in essence a prayer of praise for God. The mourner's Kaddish, which we are about to recite, does not mention death. Rather, it affirms God's justice and speaks of the value of life. Kaddish serves as a catalyst for personal spiritual growth.
Please join us if you can or may. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah v'yalma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechal Beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'izman kariv yimru Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mivarach le'alam u'almei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yipoar v'yitroman v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekudashah brichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata dush b'chata v'nechemata da'amiran bi'alma v'imru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chayim Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru, Amen. Oseh Shalom B'mromav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom, Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru, Amen.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are very privileged today to have Pastor Christian Hollick and his musical accompanist play a piece by Bloch called Prayer, and he will tell you much more.
Rodney Schuler and I will play for you Ernest Bloch's Prayer. Ernest Bloch is a Swiss-born American composer. He was born in Geneva in 1880 to Jewish parents, came to the United States in 1916, and became a U.S. citizen in 1924. He felt that to write music that expressed his Jewish identity was, quote, the only way in which I can produce music of vitality and significance. It was in 1924 that he wrote the triptych From Jewish Life. It is a series of 3 songs written for cello and piano. The first one, the one we will play for you, is titled Prayer. Bloch wrote that his intent through his musical compositions was to capture the complex, ardent Jewish spirit and soul. One musicologist wrote that this piece is reflective, emotionally intense, and expressive. Hopefully we can bring some of that out. My own thoughts as a musician playing this movement Prayer are to think of it as a reflective prayer, Lord have mercy, Lord never again, and as a forward-looking prayer. O God, make us people of resistance to all that is wrong, to all that takes away life and human dignity. Help us work towards a better tomorrow.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful experience to just sit and think and contemplate what could be better. Three people who lit candles today are going to come up and speak briefly about their parents, families, and their experiences in the Holocaust. Bernice? Yes. Bernice Simon Wilson is going to, and then Robert Melson, and then Cheryl Schley, talking about their personal family, sometimes documents, sometimes memories.
It's a lot easier if you come up over here. It's easier if you come up here for you.
Oh, and the mic.
Right.
Hi, I am Bernice Simon, and I have excerpted a diary that my cousin, who was a survivor, wrote, Burnt Abraham. This diary or document is now at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. He wrote this diary just a few years before he died in the 1980s, and before that, he never ever talked about it. And now everything came out in this diary. My early years. My name is Burnt Abraham. I was born in Berlin, Germany, the second son of the Abraham family. I had the privilege to be born in the Frauen Krankenhaus, that's a maternity hospital, in the first women's hospital or maternity hospital to have been built in Berlin. It was a hospital for expectant mothers. My older brother was born at home. I was born December 6, 1924, and I grew up in an apartment house at Barbarossa Straße 17 und bin zur Volksschule, which means the street, Barbarossa Street, and I went to the public school. We had a very large family and many relatives. My mother's family was rather large, 9 brothers and sisters. My father had only one sister who was married but had no children. So everything revolved around my mother's sisters and brothers, my aunts and uncles. My brother and I were the youngest, the babies in the family, and there were just the 2 of us in our family. But my brother isn't living anymore. He was with me for about a year and a half in Auschwitz, but he didn't make it. Growing up in Berlin wasn't too bad for my brother and me. In the beginning, we were too young to realize what was going on, and so we weren't involved in anything. Thinking back to my growing up years, it became worse and worse to be a Jew. First, they took away the privilege of having a radio, and you had to turn in your radio. And then you had to give up all your gold and silver. Then it became so bad that we couldn't go shopping for food anymore. We could shop only at certain times of the day, usually in the afternoon, when there wasn't any more food available in the shops. We were identified by the Jewish star that said Judah, which means Jew. It was a yellow star with a black border, and it was sewn on your coat. And since we were well known in the neighborhood, we could not go out without it. Otherwise, someone would have pointed us out to the police, and then we would definitely be in trouble. I remember that men in uniform would demand your ID, and you had to show them. This was probably in 1937 and 1938, before Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. November 9th, 1938. But what I remember most vividly was when I became a bar mitzvah, November 13th, 1937. On that Saturday morning, we were walking to the synagogue, and a boy across the street kept making anti-Semitic remarks, calling me a dirty Jew. That I will never forget. He called me a Drexel. It's a dirty pig, literally dirty sow, or some such thing. He was probably just a boy from the neighborhood, not a friend. In those days, we still had friends our age in the house who played with us, but that was the first time I remember so clearly someone swearing at me because I was a Jew. As were still some nice people, but I will never forget that there were still some nice people among the Germans. One evening, my father came home and he emptied his coat pockets and took out some rolls that a woman had stuck into his pocket. But not everyone was really that terrific. I almost finished the Volksschule, that's the public school. My brother was already graduated, but he could not go to the gymnasium, which was the high school. Jews were not allowed that anymore. I did not get a certificate of completion because about a month or two before graduation, they threw us out. We had to go learn some sort of trade or profession. The Yiddische Gemeinde, that's the Jewish community, had set up two schools, one to train auto mechanics and the other for cabinet makers. We were supposed to take a 3-year apprenticeship, but I had only completed 2.5 years of the carpentry course when they told me I had to go out and work. I went to work for a lumber firm, and the foreman liked me very much. He gave me some very nice jobs to do. I could make some money too, but only a certain limited amount. I worked there until the end of February 1943. That was when my father was picked up from home and sent away to a concentration camp. We never saw him again. We only knew that he was picked up and sent away. My mother, my brother, and I were home for about another week. It was March the 7th, 1943, and we were brought to the Sommerstelle, that's the collection point, where Jews were rounded up from the Jewish community. They kept us there in Berlin for 2 or 3 days, and then they transported us to Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, on March 13th, I did arrive in Auschwitz. That is a day I will never forget. Then starts the history of being in the concentration camp. Before we parted, my family, when we were on the transport, we said that after all, this is all over, we would get back to Berlin. It was a commitment to go back and meet and start life again. My brother and mother were with me when we started, but then they separated the women from the men. That was the last time I saw my mother. They asked who had trades, and they picked people with trades. My brother was a fully trained toolmaker. He had studied that for 4 years in a regular school, and he was good at it. They asked each one, "What can you do?" We were young boys, not sick in any way. My brother was exactly 1.5 years older. His name was Gerd. First, we were processed with the tattoo number. His number was next to mine. I was 107783, and he was 107784. In the camp, I did not make friends with anyone. I didn't seek out friends with anyone. Nobody did. I didn't pry into others' affairs. Somehow I made my life. If I woke up in the morning, I was all right. My brother and I were separated, but sometimes we did see each other. I did what I was told to do. It was a good thing that I knew carpentry because they needed us to work. One time an SS wanted me to make a picture frame for him, and I did that by hand. In the early stages, I tried not to make myself visible, to call attention to myself. I was tall, but I would keep against the edge of a truck or a building when the capos were out looking. Life was cheap. It was, if the SS man didn't like your face, he might grab your cap and throw it away like a frisbee, perhaps while you were standing to the side answering a call of nature. He would toss He would toss your cap as far as to the edge of the work area as possible. You would stand there and be baffled, but you knew something was not right. So you stood there not knowing what to do. Then finally, he would order you to get your hat on the double. And while you were running to retrieve the hat, the SS man would shoot you and then claim he had to shoot because you were trying fluked. That means to escape. So each day, you knew you had that day and were never sure you would come back to the barracks in the evening. Everyone knew they had quotas to fulfill, so I tried not to make myself visible, to be picked on. The food was unbearable. Each morning we were given a ration of bread, maybe a half kilo or so, and then they would pour some sort of ersatz coffee, a black liquid, into the enamel container where they put all your food. To this day, I cannot drink coffee at all. The hunger was impossible. At lunchtime, they would pour hot water soup with some sort of twigs in it. Once they gave us herring and potatoes, but as delicious as it was terrible because the herring made us thirsty and there was no running water to drink, only what we had in our tins. Sickness in the camp was a ticket for death. You got boils on your skin and infections, and you had to be careful that they did not see that or you would not make it. Once my right foot was infected, but I hid it under my pants, and finally it healed. I didn't see my brother very often, but his downfall was that he smoked. What he used to do was trade his food for cigarettes. He couldn't help it. He became sick and was put into the Krankenbau, which is an infirmary called the sick bay, and then they sent him to the Auschwitz crematorium. It sounds terrible, but there was no way I could save him. You know, I still look for him. If I go to the movies and I see a war film, I look for his face, and I look for the faces of my parents. I'm sorry. And the others, the other members of my family, I never found them. Actually, we were in a labor camp attached to Auschwitz, sort of a sub-camp called Buna. From our camp, we could see the chimneys. We knew exactly when they were burning, and we knew what was going on. We knew because it smelled, and if the wind was right, we would get the odor. I made friends only with one elderly man who used to give me some of his rations. He knew how to get around in the camp and how to manage extra rations. That old man was like my father in a way. He somehow got some special privileges and always had an extra piece of bread or would get me an extra bowl of food sometimes. I don't know where he was from, and I only knew his first name, Julius, it was. He never told me his last name. He was a support for me. I always knew that if I asked Julius for a piece of bread, somehow he would be able to find something for me if I was hungry. I never asked him how he got it or where it came from. I don't know what happened to him. As the years went by, there were less and less Jews, so they began to treat us a little better, and the killing didn't go on as rapidly anymore. They were running out of Jews, and they needed them for labor. They could no longer afford to waste lives. After our transport came into Buna from Berlin, there were no more from Germany. Then it was the Hungarians, and the last to come were the Greeks, just a few of them. And that was about the end of the transports. They needed the manpower, so they couldn't just keep killing them. The slave labor, they needed them to help with the manufacture of synthetic rubber. We were not involved with the actual manufacturing, but what we were doing was actually building the factory. Later, I was able to work as a carpenter in the camp. Perhaps that saved my life. I don't know. I remember it was at the end of January 1945, the end of the war. After we left Buna, we were on the march, and we saw that the Russians were coming after us. This was January 18, 1945. In the process of being shipped to another camp, we were transported by train and just missed being liberated by the Russians. We saw the cannon fire and heard the cannons, and we knew it was the Russians. I didn't want to take a chance. I didn't know where I was going, but that was what life was like. They brought us into Germany. As it got closer to the end, we were transported from Nordhausen, closer to the middle of Germany. As a matter of fact, at one point, our transport was attacked by British airplanes and we were stopped. They took away all the people who got killed. The British didn't know that the train contained people. We were in the cattle cars, but we were getting closer to the end of the war, and they kept moving us deeper into the middle of Germany. It was the 20th of April. I remember Hitler's birthday, a big day. We knew the Allied forces were getting closer, but still, we were not liberated. Finally, the Germans abandoned us. They were running for their lives, and our transport was overtaken by the Russians. It must have been the middle of May 1945. These are some of the memories I have. When you watch a war movie and you see the bombers coming over, that was a beautiful sight to us. When you see the lead bomber peel off and you watch the wings, maybe you'll lose your life, but they are after the Germans. I don't like to read about the Holocaust or the war. I don't read it all, period. I used to be a very avid reader when I was younger, but now I fall asleep. But I am fascinated by the war movies. What I am actually doing is I am looking for faces. It's really ridiculous, but I'm trying to see if I can find a face from the past that I remember. It is something I cannot let go. You know, it's in the imagination, but I keep hoping to find, perhaps, the faces of my mother or my father. You see, I have no graves to visit, no place to go to say Kaddish. And these are only 7 pages, came out of a 27-page diary.
Wow. Thank you for reading that.
Thank you, Bernice.
You're welcome.
That must have been hard,
It was, I almost cried, I'm sorry.
and it's important to share. Thank you. Is this working? No. Yes? No? Okay. Thank you, Bernice. Robert Melston is going to come and share some memories of his family, and then Cheryl Schley.
I'm going to read to you from a memoir that I wrote from interviews with my parents after the war. The memoir is called False Papers, Deception and Survival in the Holocaust. The passage I will read to you is a passage where my mother is actually able to get the false papers that saved our lives. But before I do that, I need to give you the context of how she was able to get the false papers. On October 12th, 1941, we were in Stanislav. I was 4 years old. We were staying with Hela, a Ukrainian young woman who was my governess. We were hiding from the Germans because on October 12, 1941, they rounded up about 30,000 Jews of Stanislav, this town in Ukraine, and shot them. We did not go to the place of assembly, so now we were in hiding with Hela, our governess. By the way, Hela is a righteous Gentile, a righteous person who saved our lives. Now we were with her. My parents didn't quite know what to do. If they ventured outside, they were likely to be arrested and killed. The only person who really could move around was my mother, because she was very Slavic looking. And people didn't know very much about her in town. My father could not move around because people knew him. He was the son of the local textile manufacturer, Julius Mendelssohn. I mentioned him before. He was the person who committed suicide. He could not move around, but she could. They decided that their only chance was to reach out to a Polish couple they knew, a young couple like them, who also had a son about my age. And this sounds preposterous, but my mother was going to go to them and ask them for their papers of identity, their identification papers, their birth certificates, their wedding certificates. And so she did. One morning she got up, she went to the Zamoyskis, explained to them the situation, and if they wanted to help us, could she get a hold of their papers? They reasonably said, we really can't give you our identity papers. These are dangerous times. However, we know that Willie, my father, comes from a wealthy family. For 25,000 zlotys, or about $5,000, wouldn't you have the papers? And we will go to the local Catholic church and we will get copies of our birth certificates and our other papers of identity. My mother knew very well by then, after the Russians got through with us and the Germans got through us, there was no way that we had $5,000. We had an old bicycle and a sewing machine and some suits of my father. That was about it. But she played along, and she said, okay, but if I'm going to ask Willie for the money, I need to see the documents. Show me what I'm buying. They were all in the kitchen. The Zamoyskis, Janina and Jan Zamoyski, went to the bedroom, came back with the documents, the birth certificates, and wedding certificates and so on. And my mother looked them over carefully and tried to memorize all pertinent facts. I need to mention two things. First of all, that she was very pretty. She had been a nightclub singer before the war in Warsaw, before she met my father. And they fell in love and married in Warsaw. I was born in Warsaw. And it so happened a few weeks before the break out of the war, September 1st, 1939, they traveled to Ukraine, Stanislav, to visit my grandfather, Julius. and the war broke out. They couldn't get back to Warsaw. That's why we were in Stanisław. But she was prepared to memorize things, as she said, and she will say again, and when I read, I remembered things very well from my acting and my singing career. The other thing I need to mention about the Zamoyskis were middle-class people. He was a functionary in the local government. They hit it off with my parents. They met by accident at a restaurant, and they compared notes, and they realized that they both had little boys, and I played with Bobby. My name was Silvio. His name was Bobby. That's all I remember. But what's important, and you can't understand what I'm going to read without realizing that the Zamoyski name is a very, very famous name in Poland. The Zamoyskis were ancestors of the Zamoyskis, were founders of the state, prime ministers, generals. They were a little bit like the Kennedys of Massachusetts or the Roosevelts of New York. I mean, they were a very famous name. The family we knew were not grand in any way, but the name itself called attention to itself. And now let me read to you what my mother decides to do. Well, before I do that, she decides she will go to the church, and she will impersonate the Zamoyskis, and she will get these papers of identity, give us a possible chance of survival. And this is my mother's voice that I transcribed. The tall black wrought iron gates of the church were open. I felt giddy as I proceeded toward the priest's outer office. The place was very busy with clerks and parishioners. Nevertheless, a young man stood up and gave me his seat. Polish men are very polite, especially when it comes to a pretty woman. Perhaps Madame would like a teensy smoke. I took a cigarette. I sat down, lit up, grateful for the cigarette, and realized, to my surprise, that I was as calm as a rock. I decided to treat the whole experience like a performance of the Adria. The Adria was a nightclub where my mother performed before the war. Finally, I was ushered into the priest's study. He was an elderly man, perhaps 70, tall, totally bald, dressed in a black cassock. He had been standing, paging through a book, but he sat down behind his desk without offering me a seat. However, when I looked up, I thought he had a plain but sympathetic face and a cheerful disposition. Suddenly, I was prepared to like him. "How can I help you, Madame?" he asked. I smiled and answered him in the most disarming way I could. "But Father, don't you remember me?" The good father looked bewildered. There is a Yiddish expression that goes, "Haben den Fisch am Schwanz," holding the fish by its tail. And I knew he couldn't possibly remember me, so I repeated the question, "Father, don't you remember me?" There's been so many people here today, it's hard to remember everyone. I am Countess Zamoyska, Janina Zamoyska. For a moment, he looked like he was going to faint. He stood up and started bustling about. The Zamoyski name had produced its magic. "My dear Countess, Your Excellency, please have a seat. How about some tea or a little glass of wine?" "Oh no, thank you. I never drink in the morning." "My dear father, I've come here to ask you for a huge favor. Before they left, the Russians confiscated all our documents. They were about to arrest us and deport us. But then the Germans came, the Russians, the Germans. May the cholera take them all away. In any case, we don't have a single piece of identification. Should the Gestapo ask for our papers, we have nothing to show them, and we're likely to be in a lot of trouble. Perhaps, dear father, you can help me in this matter. I was baptized here. So was my husband. So is my little boy. I need birth certificates for the three of us. I needed his help, but I didn't want to look pitiful, so I gave him my most radiant smile. "There's no problem, my dear Countess," he said. "Let me just jot down a few minor details." He took a pad of paper and a pen and began to question me. "Your full name, your date of birth, your place of birth, your mother's name, your father's name, your husband's full name, his date of birth, his place of birth, his father's name, his mother's name, your son's name, his date of birth, his place of birth." I had been a quick study back at the Adria. I was prepared, and I never faltered.
Thank you so much. An amazing story of survival and the different ways that some people survived. Your mother must have been remarkable. Cheryl Schley, going to come and speak with us. Thank you.
So I had mentioned I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor. My father, David Schley, passed away in 2012 at the age of 89. But he had a very, as he used to say, tumultuous life. And I'd like to just share a little bit about his life and his experience at the Holocaust. David Schley also, so we spell our name S-C-H-L-E-Y. And in Poland, where he was born, Warsaw, Poland, it was S-Z-L-E-J. And when he came to the United States eventually, someone asked him his name, and they just ended up writing down any name. So I often get people that will write me out of the blue, and they'll say, "We're related." And I'm like, "No, we're not." There's no one related to me, because I have no family. So my dad was born in 1922 in Warsaw, Poland. He was the youngest of 3 boys in his family. His father owned a leather shop, and his mother sold wigs. In 1940, when he was 18, the Germans occupied the Jewish ghetto and surrounded it with a wall. In 1943, the Germans began a major roundup of the remaining Jews who hadn't already died due to disease and starvation or put to death in the Treblinka concentration camp in Poland. This time, the Germans encountered Jewish-named armed resistance, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in which my father participated and was one of the last resistance fighters. He managed to survive a bullet and was transported to Majdanek concentration camp. His parents and brothers and all his aunts and uncles were all taken and killed in other concentration camps, so he was the sole survivor of his entire family. His parents, over the next 2 years, he was transferred to 4 additional concentration camps and ended up surviving them all before he was liberated from Buchenwald by the American Army on April 12, 1945. In the concentration camp, he actually shared a barrack with the novelist Elie Wiesel, and there is a famous picture at Yad Vashem that's hanging, and he's in the barrack with him. I have a picture of him. There's quite a number of people there. Elie Wiesel standing up. They weigh, I think, all of 50 pounds each. And my father is in a barrack. It's almost unrecognizable because he's so thin. He then, after they were freed, he went with a group of young survivors to live in Switzerland and ended up working for a furrier there, and then was relocated to the United States 4 years later. He ended up marrying my mother, meeting my mother, marrying my mother in 1955. And then basically devoted his life to his family and to Zionism, to Jewish culture, and to the labor movement. And as I mentioned, he passed away in 2012. Very long life, very strong man, a real survivor. I grew up learning how to survive, basically. And we miss him to this day. He did get to see his two grandchildren, my two children and my brother's two children, but he didn't get to see his great-grandchildren. In 1947, he wrote a short memoir, which I'm not going to read, and a poem about his experience in the Holocaust, which was translated by the Center for Holocaust Studies in 1984. And I'd like to read the poem. It's a very short poem. Slowly beats the terrible hour, and the trains go through the night. Quietly do I make the trip, holding my emotions still. One dreams and one wonders of loneliness, lost and having given up. I don't think of my home. Somewhere in the wide, wide world beats a heart that understands me. Away from the big city tumult, alone do I travel to death. And he wrote that in 1947. When my kids were going to Hebrew school, this was in the 1990s, my dad, we grew up, and I think this is very common with Holocaust survivors. They didn't talk about it growing up. We didn't talk about the Holocaust. It was kind of unspoken. And my father was watching TV, and he saw a Holocaust denier, and he realized, he got very angry. And my kids were in Hebrew school, and I happened to be walking out, and there was a little sheet of paper about Steven Spielberg doing the program, the Yom HaShoah, and asking for people to be taped, Holocaust survivors, so that they could record it and document it there in Yad Vashem. And I brought it to my father, and he didn't want to do it, but then he saw the denier, and he said, I need to do this. So someone from Steven Spielberg came to our house and taped him, and I've got that tape, and it's also in Yad Vashem. So the grandchildren, everyone in our family has seen that, and it's very moving. And it's, he's interviewed for about 2 hours about his life and experience in the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheryl and Robert and Bernice, for sharing. It's hard. I was going to share something, but next year. We have Mr. Stephen Kramer, who I've just met today. And thank you, Fran, for letting us know about Stephen. And he's going to share a poem. Great. Thank you so much.
A little background for the poem. About 4 years ago, my wife Celeste, who's with me tonight, and I went to Poland on a trip to visit a couple of places. The first was to visit Stalag 3. And the reason that we went there, Stalag 3 is the place where Great Escape is filmed. Most of you probably have seen. And the reason we went there is that was the POW camp where my father had spent about a year between 1944 and 45. He was a navigator of a B-17 that was shot down in Berlin in June of 44 and beaten up by the Gestapo. He was able to survive and get to prison camp. they did what was called the March to Mooseburg in January of '45, where not all that many survived, and I think he went from 160 to 90 pounds. And we had sort of known that he was involved in the war, but we didn't really know that much about it. He never talked about it until when he died. I found about a 40-page diary that he had written in his law cabinet, along with a piece of his parachute and his Purple Heart. And I read the diary fairly quickly, used parts of it to give a eulogy the next day, and basically found out afterwards that a bunch of people that had either been prisoners of war or had been on his plane had tried to contact him ever since 1945, and he had never responded to them at all, which is sort of similar to what a lot of people talk about with the Holocaust, that they just never talked about it. I do recall, however, that for some reason on Friday nights when I was about 12 years old, he used to like watching 12 O'Clock High, and I never quite knew why until I read the diary and found out what the reason was. And I ended up writing a story about lessons from a war diary. It's out on the table out there if anybody wanted to look at it. But the next day after we went to Stalag 3, which by the way was quite an experience in the sense that if you've seen The Great Escape, there's a tunnel that they went through of a couple of 100 yards that you could actually go through as part of visiting the place, and I actually did that. It's not a place for those who have claustrophobia, but you could make it all the way through, and it was worth it. But the next day we went on a tour to Auschwitz, and I look back on the 10 hours that we spent at Auschwitz that day as a combination of the worst day I ever spent in my life and the best day I ever spent in my life, and for the following reasons. One is what we saw and experienced the day that we were there really is unimaginable, but I think it's, for most of us, if you have the chance, it's worth seeing. But when I say it was the best day also, it was something that I pull upon every once in a while to say that how lucky we are to never have, after having seen that, you never have a right to complain about anything in your life after you saw what people had to go through. And we saw pretty much every exhibit, went through Auschwitz, Auschwitz-Birkenau. And when I was done that day, I do a lot of writing. I write op-eds and things like that. And I wanted to try to capture not just statistically, what I'd seen or just a basic description of what I saw, but somehow try to capture the imagery of what is left with you when you see that, and how it's not even depression, but something that's about as difficult an emotion as you could have, so that I could basically put it into words and pass it on. And I've presented it in a few places, and I'll read it for you now. And it's not easy to listen to, but these are the images that when you go to Auschwitz or Birkenau, Bergen-Belsen, any of those places, this is what's left. And the name of the poem is Images of Auschwitz, Man's Inhumanity to Man. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And it goes as follows. Daddy's shirt was neatly pressed, his boots were cleaned and shined. Though his job was difficult, he never seemed to mind. Daddy told his little boy, tonight we'll get ice cream. He adored his darling son, embraced him, and then beamed. He worked each day at Auschwitz, where the guards he supervised unloaded all the families when boxcar trains arrived. Every train was overcrowded, no one else could fit. Standing inside trains for days without a place to sit. Elders, moms, and children, tired, starving, and in pain, many soiled in their own waste when they came off the train. Children clutched their teddy bears with fear upon their faces. Their parents told them they had arrived at a much better place. When older folks got off the trains, their eyes revealed their fears. They seemed to realize the fate that waited for them here. When most folks came off the trains, they had to form a line. Many looked around in fear. Some began to cry. All were told, remove your clothes so you can take hot showers. Daddy said, you'll all be safe and warm within an hour. Then the line was told to enter a cold concrete room. Women guards assured them that hot showers would start soon. But suddenly the door slammed shut, the room turned dark with gloom. Guards poured poison Xylon B in roof vents to the room. Daddy stood and listened to the poor souls trapped inside. They screamed and cried, they gasped for air, fell silent, and they died. One more cruel atrocity was done to these poor souls. Their body cavities were searched for jewelry, rings, and gold. Jewish prisoners were assigned to undertake the task, then take to crematorium ovens victims who'd been gassed. Children who an hour before had held their teddy bears became the smoke and ashes rising in the Auschwitz air. Some folks who arrived at Auschwitz were quite weak or ill. They became experiments, were tortured, and then killed. Mengel's doctors treated them like laboratory mice, amputated arms and legs, soaked them for hours in ice. And when these souls could take no more and neared their final breath, lethal injections in the heart put all of them to death. Daddy had the same routine at Auschwitz every day. Killing thousands who arrived was all in his day's pay. At home each night, his wife would ask him, how was your day, dear? He'd reply, the usual, sit down and have a beer. Then after dinner, Daddy took his family for ice cream. Back home, he put his son to bed and wished him pleasant dreams. This is how at Nazi death camps 6 million were killed. Hitler's goal to kill all Jews seemed it might be fulfilled. The crimes at Auschwitz and these camps were not that long ago. Yet some now wear Camp Auschwitz shirts at rallies where they go. When some hear of the Holocaust, they say it isn't true. They should visit a death camp, or perhaps a few. The task for every generation, each woman and man, is learn and teach what took place there so it never happens again. Now, that's tough to hear, especially for people, I'm sure, that lost family there, but this is the images that have to stick, not just with us, but the next generation and the next generation, so that what's going on now, for people that don't believe it, and people that joke around putting swastikas and things on schools and stuff, understand what they're doing when they do this. So it's great that everybody's here tonight, and the main thing I would just say is to keep passing it on to whoever else can, and that's why I wrote this. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think those images will stick with us for a long time. Sharon Leader. Sharon's going to read a poem that's part of a collection, and Sharon, you'll tell us more about that. Thank you. And then we're going to have a song.
Good evening. I'm reading a poem from a collection that my husband Milton Teichman and I did. Milton is sitting in the back, in order to teach about the Holocaust to students in college from the feeling dimension of the experience, and not from the facts or the data or the numbers really, but what survivors wrote, and also those writers who perished, what survived. This particular poem was written by a Hungarian young man, Miklos Radnati, who was an up-and-coming poet in Hungary before the Nazi takeover. And the poem was written May 19th, 1944, and it was found in a mass grave, the debris of a forced labor camp that Jewish members of Hungary were forced to work in, by his wife when the grave was uncovered in the pocket of his trench coat, one of the poems that he wrote while he was in that forced camp. It's called Fragment, and when Deb asked us to pick a poem, I picked a poem which I thought could help us reflect on the difficulty it is when we're living through an age when certain steps around us are being taken that may prepare us to accept hate. Let's think about whether any of these conditions exist right now and how we can, even in our own worlds, our own local communities, do something to contribute to kindness and a loving community, to keep loving community alive. Fragment. I lived on this earth in an age when man fell so low, he killed willingly for pleasure, without orders. Mad obsessions threaded his life. He believed in false gods. Deluded, he foamed at the mouth. I lived on this earth in an age when it was honor to betray and to murder. The traitor and the thief were heroes. Those who were silent, unwilling to rejoice, were hated as if they had the plague. I lived on this earth in an age when if a man spoke out, he had to go into hiding and could only chew his fists in shame. Drunk on blood and scum, the nation went mad and grinned at its horrible fate. I lived on this earth in an age when a curse was the mother of a child, when women were happy if they miscarried. A glass of thick poison foamed on the table, and the living envied the rotting silence of the dead. I lived on this earth in an age when the poets too were silent and waited for Isaiah, the scholar of terrifying words, to speak again, since only he could utter the right curse.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Poetry speaks another language, and now we're going to have the language of music. Thank you to Harriet.
But only if you all help me. And if you don't know the melody, you can hum along if you don't know the words. And then I'll repeat it in English. This is from a poem by another Hungarian poet, young Hanna Senes. I won't tell you her story, but there's a wonderful biography that comes from the name of her, another poem of hers, God Bless the Match Consumed in Kindling Flame. Eli, Eli. Eli, Eli, שלא ייגמר לעולם, החור והים Rish Rush Shel Hamayim Berak Hashamayim Tfilat Ha'adam Hachol V'Hayam Rish Rush Shel Hamayim Berak Hashamayim Tfilat Hadam. My God, that these things never shall cease. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the thunder from heaven, prayer from the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, thunder from heaven, and prayer from the heart.
Thank you so much, Harriet. That was beautiful. So, the second part, the end part of our program, is going to be about resistance. We know the world sometimes is filled with hate, and sometimes it feels like it is again. So, Ira is going to be talking about an example of resistance, and Rod, right in front of me, is going to be giving another example of resistance. And then a few folks are going to talk about resistance today. They're going to be talking about, obviously, during the Holocaust. And then Jessica, Francis, and Madeline are going to be talking about resistance today. And then we have another wonderful piece on the cello. And that'll be the end of the evening. Thank you so much.
So what does resistance look like? What are the forms that it could take? So I will be talking about historical resistance during the Holocaust. One of the ways in which people resisted was to keep living. That in itself is a form of resistance. It is as my wife read the story of her cousin Bernd, was that each day was another day, another beginning. Yesterday was past, today is today. And then the next day will occur. And if it doesn't, I'm not here. And that's a resistance. The resistance of people who set up secret schools in ghettos so that children could continue learning, that they painted, that they wrote music, that they wrote poetry. That's resistance. In the Warsaw Ghetto, a number of scholars put together a record of the daily events. They went and collected documents. They saw what was going on, and they put them into cans, milk cans, and buried them so that there would be a record of what had occurred at a future time. And people could not say, this never happened. That's resistance. And Emmanuel Ringenbaum, who was the coordinator of such a program, had been offered many times to be saved and brought out of the ghetto, of the Warsaw Ghetto, and he refused because he saw his responsibility, his job, was to record, to write, and to remember. So that's a form of resistance. Another form of resistance is organizing ways in which you could save people, whether it's one person, two people, 5 people. There's a belief that Jews often went to the slaughter like sheep, that they never fought back. But the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is a prime example of a people who said at this point in time that one we're not going to live, but we will die with honor. We will redeem ourselves. And outnumbered, outgunned, they fought the German units for more than, I would think, 30 days. And in burning buildings, they stayed until the very end. So resistance can be armed, resistance can be writing, could be poetry, could be hiding. Anne Frank and her family and neighbors who hid for a number of years, that's resistance, is not showing up and being deported, that's resistance. And one should not underestimate the notion of how do you resist this kind of tyranny and hatred. I was left with this thought. If you remember in the war that went on in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia fell apart, and the Serbs rounded up several thousands of Muslims, men, Bosnians, and put them in a concentration camp. And I remember seeing that picture in the newspaper of mostly men, of men thin, men young, men old. And they were behind wire, barbed wire. And they were killed all by the Serbs. And you say, well, why didn't they resist? And the answer is, when you are put in that position, what is the possibility of resisting? So people need to understand that the terror, that it's almost impossible sometimes to resist, but you are resisting by holding on to your dignity, by not giving in. And I think that, I have a list of various things that, there was resistance movements in France where they rescued children. There were resistant movements in conjunction with monasteries and shelters in Italy that rescued people. But that required people actually becoming active and moving together. So resistance can be many things. It could be the fact that you could stand there and look at the camera, knowing that this is the end, and holding on to your dignity. So that I see as resistance. Poetry, art, music, teaching. There was a story of there was a very famous orphanage in Warsaw, and the director of that orphanage was again asked they wanted to rescue him, and he refused to leave his children. And when the deportation came, he went with them. He organized them, went with them, and died with them in Auschwitz. So that's resistance also. And I think it's important to know, I'm not suggesting that that's the future. What I'm saying is that there are ways in which in that particular time, in a particular time of extremists, that those were the avenues that were open to people. Whether it was children going through the walls in Warsaw Ghetto, smuggling food into the ghetto, whether it was false identities being created, all of that is a form of resistance in those days.
Thank you so much, Ira. A lot of the stories we heard today were forms of resistance from Bernice and Cheryl and Robert Melson. And thank you, Roderick McDonald. Reverend Roderick McDonald is going to speak about another example of resistance. Thank you.
It's a real privilege to be able to briefly share the story of one of the righteous voices of resistance during the Holocaust. His name was Jan Karski. Some of you are recognizing that name. And he risked his life to raise his voice to try to tell the world what was happening to Jewish people in his native Poland. His story is now a one-person play called Remember This. It aired on PBS last month, starring the actor David Strathairn, and it's still available on PBS website. It's highly recommended. Jan Karski was born Jan Kozalewski to Roman Catholic parents in Poland. After his education, he was a diplomatic intern in the Polish Foreign Service. The future looked bright for him, and then his world changed and the whole world changed in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west and Russia from the east. And Karski joined the armed forces. He was captured but rescued by the Polish underground, and he became a courier for the resistance, doing the dangerous work of carrying secrets from his homeland to the Polish government in exile in London. He had a photographic memory which served him very well in that role. But he was captured again. He was tortured. He even attempted suicide because he was afraid he would be tortured into revealing secrets. He survived and was freed again by the underground, and he resumed his courier work for the resistance. One day he was approached by some Jewish leaders and asked if he would come and witness what was happening to their people. So he visited the Warsaw Ghetto, and he described what he saw there as degradation, starvation, and death. He took the risk of impersonating a guard at the Izbika holding camp, and he saw families being herded onto train cars, and he learned the horror of where they were being taken. So in his next courier work, he had a message of what he had witnessed and what he had heard and seen. He made the risky trip across Nazi Europe to London. He spoke there with Churchill's Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. He crossed the ocean to Washington, D.C. He spoke to President Roosevelt. In each case, he sounded the alarm. He pleaded for direct intervention to stop the Holocaust. His pleas fell on largely deaf and disbelieving ears, and he suffered greatly because of that. He was instructed to stay in the U.S., where he continued to lecture and to write and to try to affect American public opinion. When the war finally ended, he became a member of the faculty at Georgetown University. But the Holocaust continued to be the shaping reality of his life, and he continued to speak out on behalf of Holocaust victims and survivors. He was awarded the honor of Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, and he was awarded a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama. In 1981, he spoke at a meeting of American military officers who had helped to liberate the death camps. He said to them that he had failed to fulfill his wartime mission. And he said, "And thus I myself became a Jew. And just as my wife's entire family was wiped out in the ghettos of Poland, in its concentration camps and crematoria, so have all the Jews who were slaughtered become my family. But I am a Christian Jew. I am a practicing Catholic. My faith tells me the second original sin has been committed by humanity. This sin will haunt humanity to the end of time, and I want it to be so.
Thank you so much for sharing that amazing story. Somebody said, I don't know who it was, there were something like 26,000 on the list of the righteous.
Yes.
We just needed more. So for the end of the program, we are going to have, luckily, we're going to have Jessica Dill, Francis Coco, and, am I saying your name right? Okay, good. And Madeline Hillis-Deneen talk a little bit about what we can do today, because we know hate never really goes away, it just submerges. So thank you. All three you might want to come up together and share some thoughts, and then we will be blessed to have one more piece by Christian. Thank you.
We just heard once again about the horrors of the Holocaust and the courageous and righteous acts of resistance. Hatred of the Jews has been called the canary in the coal mine. Once there is permission or encouragement to express this hatred, there is unleashed permission to express disregard or worse for any minority or marginalized group, Black and brown people, immigrants, LGBTQ, disabled, the list goes on. This Jewish hatred is often based on troubling and outlandish tropes, still believed today by many. I'd like to briefly review some of these tropes and report to you a few of the results from a recent Anti-Defamation League survey on anti-Semitism in America. Some of these tropes. Jews have too much power. They seek global domination. They control the media by influence with politicians, control the global financial system. They are capitalist exploiters. Oh, and they're also socialists and communists. I also want to mention that they constitute 0.02% of the world population and 2% of the population of the United States. In Charlottesville, Virginia, not too long ago, we heard white supremacists chanting, "Jews will not replace us." What does that mean? I think it was referring to the many Jews who support such things as immigration reform, a woman's right to choose, civil rights, all of which are seen to suppress the white race. Jews are disloyal. As exiles over the centuries, immigrants with their own languages, practices, and culture, they've often been seen as the other, only for themselves. Jews are greedy. Jews committed deicide, and Jews use Christian blood for rituals. The Holocaust never happened. Anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel are never anti-Semitic. Okay, so some of the ADL results include the following, which I find very distressing, well, you'll see. There's a widespread belief in these anti-Jewish tropes at rates unseen for decades. Over 85% of Americans believe at least one of these Jewish tropes, as opposed to 61% that believe that in 2019. 20%, that is 1 in 5 people surveyed who were a representative demographic of United States population, 1 in 5 believe in 6 or more tropes, which is significantly more than the 11% found by the ADL in 2019, and is the highest level measured in decades. There's substantial rates of Israel-focused anti-Semitism. Many Americans believe Israel-oriented anti-Semitic positions, from 40% who at least somewhat believe that Israel treats Palestinians like Nazis treated the Jews, to 18% who are uncomfortable spending time with a person who supports Israel. There's nearly a 40% correlation between belief in anti-Jewish tropes and anti-Israel belief, meaning that a substantial number of people who believe anti-Jewish tropes also have negative attitudes towards Israel. Okay, so we're here, we're preaching to the choir, we are the choir. So what can we as individuals do to resist hate and bias? Yes, we can donate to causes that support equal justice and equal opportunities. We can write letters to our congressional representatives that support anti-bias legislation. We can write letters to the editor that express our reactions to editorials, to other letters to the editor, or news articles. And we can ACT, ACT, which is an acronym for Ask, Choose, Teach. In social situations, at a meeting, at the dinner table, wherever you hear statements of bias, you can try to be brave and ask questions like, what makes you say that? Why do you think that is true? Do you know what that means? And the technique of asking questions is because so many of these attitudes are not logical, we can't fight illogical feeling or emotion or belief with logic, but we can open up a conversation. Do you know what that means? Did you intend to be hurtful? Would you agree that? Pointing out another point of view. Would you want to hear another perspective? That's the A. C in ACT. C is to choose. You can choose to be an upstander as opposed to a bystander. Don't ignore expressions of bias or anti-Semitism or hate of any kind. Question and interrupt, because choosing to do or say nothing implies agreement. The T is to teach. And we do that by living our lives as an example to our children and grandchildren, friends and relatives and colleagues. Inform yourself and inform others about the issues as we are doing today. There are so many websites with accurate and helpful information. I think I have a list, and there's no way for me to give that to you today, but I think what I'll do is send the list to the webmaster of the Am Hayam website, and you could just Google Am Hayam, and I'll have a list of resources where if you would be interested in doing so, you can further educate yourself on some of these issues. And we can work within our community to combat anti-Semitism, hate, and bias. What you do and what you say has a ripple effect. And if you have the picture of throwing a rock into a pond and you see the ripples going wider and farther apart, that's the impact we have of what we say and also what we don't say. So as the name of this evening is, what we do matters, and I certainly want to underscore that. Thank you.
In regards to actions all of us can take to fight anti-Semitism, you probably heard about Robert Kraft. He's created a new campaign entitled Stand Up to Jewish Hate through his foundation to combat anti-Semitism. His hope is that this campaign will become an effort that builds bridges with all Americans. He stresses the need to educate, raise awareness, and empower all Americans to stand up against Jewish hate. Quotes from two of his ads are, "Hate only wins if you let it," and "Voices of support are louder than words of hate." Another resource is the American Jewish Committee, whose goal is to provide knowledge and tools to understand, respond to, and prevent anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League's website has a wealth of information on this topic, including how to be an ally, advocate, and activist. They defined an ally as someone who speaks out on behalf of or takes actions that are supportive of someone else. An example would be hearing someone use an anti-Semitic slur and reaching out to that person to tell them you think they are wrong. An advocate is someone who publicly supports or recommends a particular cause or policy. An example would be writing a letter to your congressional representative to urge her or him to support legislation against anti-Semitism. An activist is someone who gets involved in activities that are meant to achieve political or social change. An example would be participating in a demonstration that is focusing on anti-Semitic hate crimes. All three of these terms involve people who stand up to bias, bullying, or hate in some way. And the Anti-Defamation League also suggests taking the following actions: educate yourself and be an advocate for others' education and protection. For example, you can approach schools about adding programs and curriculum on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Stop the spread. This means not just speaking out against hate speech that you hear, but also reporting what you see on social media every time you see it, and this really applies to the young people especially. Community outreach. Be involved and aware of what is happening in your community. One way to do this would be to encourage the presentation of outreach events to inform the community of what is being done to combat anti-Semitism. Reporting hate crimes. If you experience or are a witness to anti-Semitism, report it immediately. The ADL has an online form for this. Reportable activity could be anything from seeing a hate symbol on the street to kids getting bullied at school or online. Some other suggested actions you can take are to show compassion and encouragement to those who are victims of anti-Semitism, to refuse to participate in hateful speech or behavior, and if it is safe to do so, to tell the perpetrator of such words or actions to stop. We can shine a light in the darkness and counteract the negative with the positive. One way to do this is to highlight contributions that Jews have made to humankind across the ages. When I was Googling information for this presentation, I came across a website about a 2017 exhibit at the Jewish Museum of Spain entitled Main Contributions of the Jews to the Modern World, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. It contained an extensive list covering everything from medicine, such as the development of vaccines and of medications and treatments for cancer, hepatitis, and AIDS, to science, such as quantum physics, topography, psychology, modern anthropology, and neurology, to inventions, such as the gasoline-fueled car, cardiac pacemaker and defibrillator, and color photography, to technology, such as weather radar, the remote control, magnetic resonance, and the World Wide Web, to the arts, literature, music, theater, and film, as well as the creation of UNICEF and the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In conclusion, we must stand together because the only way to stop the cycle of ignorance, intolerance, and hate is through knowledge, empathy, and love.
For many years, I worked on creating programs like this with two teachers that I'd like to acknowledge, Diane Kean and Ann Needell. And they took a program called Facing History and Ourselves, a very, very important program. We are fortunate that here in this school district, the Holocaust is taught, because that is not true in all places in this country. I recall visiting the American Holocaust Museum in D.C. in 2017, shortly after the inauguration of a twice impeached president. And there's a whole section in the beginning, the lead up. And those headlines were so much like what was happening in our country then and continues to right now that it is frightening. And so what we do here does matter, because even if it is preaching to the choir, we still, I think every single one of us probably came away with an inspiration or a thought or learned something we didn't know before. And that is important. So I'd like to read, however, this statement by the High Commissioner of the UN Commission for Human Rights. His name is Volker Turk. And he gave this statement this past January on the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. And he says, "Today we remember and honor the victims of the Holocaust, the 6 million Jews, Roma and Sinti people, Slavs, people with disabilities, LGBTI people, prisoners of war, and the members of the anti-Nazi networks across Europe whose voices of resistance were forever silenced. Auschwitz-Birkenau, where brutal and abhorrent crimes were committed, was liberated 78 years ago. It is an acutely painful day of remembrance as we recall the deep abyss of torment, heartache, and human suffering. This year we reflect on the theme of home and belonging, two notions of safety that were callously destroyed by the state-sponsored widespread ideology of hatred, persecution, and murder perpetrated by the Nazi Party and their collaborators. Home and belonging forever transformed as millions faced deportation and incarceration. Home and belonging gone as they were tortured and murdered. But amidst the horrors, I am moved by the countless stories of resilience and courage, from the victims who forged deep friendships with others in the concentration camps, to the individuals who bravely risked their lives to share their homes and shelter people in hiding, to the survivors of the Holocaust, who rediscovered beauty and meaning in life after enduring the worst of humanity, who built families, careers, and futures in the face of profound trauma, who reestablished the sense of safety, home, and belonging that had been ripped away from them. Emerging from history's darkest hours and healing from profound pain takes extraordinary strength. As a child born in post-war Austria, these events shaped me and whole generations. Our world perspective was permanently imprinted with the horrors that happened just kilometers away. But we also found hope. This year we mark the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document conceived in the aftermath of these heinous crimes, a document that captures the determination of a generation that suffered the devastation of 2 global wars and the Holocaust. A commitment from leaders the world over that justice, respect for human dignity, equality, and rights are crucial to enduring peace. A promise driven by the call to prevent another Holocaust and to reaffirm the concept of human dignity. The world said never again. Yet, anti-Semitism continues to escalate, with increasing attacks and violence against Jewish communities around the globe. Online and offline, hate speech is intensifying, and the ongoing Holocaust denial and distortion of facts, the attempted rewriting of history deeply undermines the suffering of generations. I welcome the Holocaust denial resolution adopted last year by the UN General Assembly, a crucial milestone in the fight against anti-Semitism. Now as ever, we must also invest in education, the most important antidote to any form of intolerance and xenophobia. I join the General Assembly's call that societies be educated truthfully about the facts of the Holocaust. Today, in their memory and in the face of rising xenophobia, intolerance, racism, and racial discrimination, I call for a unified and steadfast commitment to reject any attack against humanity that may lead to genocide. We cannot erase the horrors of the Holocaust, but we must stand together against hate now and in the future. We owe nothing less to the victims and the survivors. And I wanted to add earlier, and I didn't, but I'm going to say it now. The fact is that, my understanding anyway, is that Hitler modeled his extermination of the Jews and his whole program there on how American people treated the slaves, the slavery here in this country. And that is a chilling fact. And that is why it's important that we all stand together. This is a call for love, for humanity, all of our fellows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica Francis Madeline. I think we'll take your advice too and put some of these organizations onto our website and maybe onto Nasset Interfaith website as well. So we have one more treat to end the evening. Thank you so much, Pastor Halleck. And he will tell us what he's playing, and once it's over, if anybody wants to come up and ask any questions, you're more than welcome. Thank you.
Rodney Schuler and I will play Spiegel im Spiegel. Spiegel im Spiegel was composed in 1978 by the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, who was born in 1935. The title is German and can be translated either as mirror in mirror or mirrors in mirror, thus alluding to a mirror producing an infinity of images. The music has been described as mystic minimalism. You will hear a recurring low note on the piano that is grounding, that some have described as akin to the ringing of bells. I find the music reflective and calming. Arvo Pärt himself was a Christian, first Lutheran, but then later leaving the Lutheran Church to become an Orthodox Christian. His music, this particular piece, has been widely used in many different films, television, dance, theater, even to accompany figure skaters. It was used in the 2005 film Auschwitz, the Nazis and the Final Solution, the 2015 BBC television documentary Touched by Auschwitz, and in 2020, the Cincinnati Symphony's artist in residence, Guy Braunstein, performed this piece saying, "It allows us to reflect and remember the Holocaust through the power of music." It is late. We invite you to stay and listen to the end, or to leave in respectful silence, both remembering the past and making a commitment to resistance of persecution, violence, and evil. I say that because the piece is somewhat long, reflective, and haunting. So you are welcome to stay as long as you wish and then to leave in silence.
don't want to say anything. I don't want to ruin the beautiful mood. Thank you so much, Pastor Halleck. And thank you all for coming, being with us tonight.